All right, welcome to our first episode of Birds and Bytes for 2023. Our episode today is on the Winter Finch Forecast. I'm happy to introduce Tyler Hoar to our Chicago Ornithological Society event. Welcome, Tyler, and you can take it away.
Oh, good evening. Thanks for having me. I'm glad that you're actually having winter weather too. We just had winter weather here near Toronto yesterday, which is actually, if you love winter finches, winter weather is good. But green and brown grass winters are not good for winter finches. They don't have to move. Okay, I'm talking about the Winter Finch Forecast. It comes out in August, late August, early September. I get a lot of information from people, and we put it together to try to get it out right around the end of September. Things do change with Mother Nature. It's kind of like forecasting weather. Sometimes people love you and sometimes people don't. Here we go. The origins of the Winter Finch Forecast started in 1999. Ron Pittaway ran this for 20 years. It was very informal for the first few years. In 2003, he started setting up a format, which I'll discuss in a second. It got people's enthusiasm when he started posting online about what finches you could possibly see. And then when the finches actually listened to Ron and came, people started paying more notice to it. And it's looked forward to by a lot of Canadian birders, but since I've taken this over from Ron in 2020, I realized how many people in the United States really love this. We sample several tree species. We send out requests for people in midsummer who want to go become a cone crop reporter and ask them to look at these tree species and look at the cone crop and the berry crop specifically to see what we'll get in the winter. In the boreal forest, for a lot of these finches, tamarack, the birches, and white spruce are the big drivers. This year in the eastern boreal forest, most of this was very poor, except for the ashes and the eastern white cedar, which we'll discuss it when we hit the species. A couple of species, especially the ash, had a big effect on them. A second here. The winter finch eruptions depends on these various species, the winter finches here on the left, their food sources on the right. If they don't have a good tree crop of, say, white spruce, certain species will move. Like white-winged crossbills, they're really tied to spruce and tamarack cone crops. And if they don't have a good cone crop, they're very nomadic. They'll just get up and move across North America to look for it in the middle of the year. And if they have a good cone crop where they are, sometimes they'll breed in the middle of winter if the cone crop is that good. The cone crop system we send out the requests for people to look at it. It's very informal because we have people who are foresters, we have bird watchers, average naturalists. So we can't give a scientific regimen of saying what you have to do in these forums. We just have asked the people in your area, where have you been, in your personal opinion, do you think the crop is good, very poor, average, bumper where the branches start bending, and excellent when the branches start bending, or bumper when it looks like the cone crop is so heavy and berry crop so heavy that the actual branches will break. In the eastern boreal forest in 2019, we had probably one of the best cone and berry crops in close to 30 years, the best one I've seen. It was so good. This is where area I was working up on the James Bay coast. This is in July. White-winged crossbills were showing up by the hundreds each day, and they brought, on the right-hand side here, there's two juvenile white-winged crossbills that probably just left the nest within the last 2 weeks beforehand. The parents grabbed them, flew them to the new spot where there was a bumper crop of food, dropped them off, and they had started breeding again. Issues that can affect the seed crop. In 2021, we had quite a big effect. We had widespread drought in North America. We had intense forest fires right across from central North America to the west, and insect infestations primarily in the east, which is spruce budworm, which I'll talk more in depth later on. This year in 2022, it was primarily just the spruce budworms that had an effect on the winter finches. The winter finches come out of the boreal forest from Newfoundland in the far east all the way up to the far end of Alaska, from the border states up to the edge of tree line, which basically the whole top of the green here is the tree line in North America. It's a very large, relatively intact forest and home to millions of finches. This in 2020, each dot represents a location of someone who reported the cone crop information to us this year. It's pretty wide. You can see it's primarily based around Ontario, New England, and Duluth, upper Wisconsin, but we have had people this year in northern Arizona, several people in Alaska, some people on the East Coast. The more holes we can fill in Chicago area of people who would like to volunteer, it helps provide a better source of information and more well-rounded. This year we got several people in Pennsylvania who reported, and we knew that the acorn crop is really poor there, and the acorn crop was very poor in eastern North America here. So the blue jays went even further south. In 2020, we had a good to excellent crop of cones in the western boreal forest from northwestern Ontario all the way to Alaska. Last year, it was basically from Duluth, Lake Michigan, eastward to Newfoundland. There was a belt of food that brought the birds in. And this year, we have it's a bumper crop of spruce that goes all the way from Ontario to Alaska area, Yukon, all the way down to northern Arizona. It is apparently one of the biggest crops people have seen in decades in the Western Canada and in the Rocky Mountains. So species like crossbills and siskins will move east and west across North America searching for this crop. And this year, they went for that crop, and they've left us in huge numbers. The first species I'm going to talk about is the white-winged crossbill. This is a nice male who wasn't feeding on new cones. He's on the ground looking for any cones that were on the ground, trying to find last year's crop because it wasn't a good crop at this location. When you're out and you see cones on the ground, and a lot of cones on the ground, take a peek sometimes. The white-winged crossbills and red crossbills will come to the ground looking for these cones. The estimated population in Ontario is 5 million, over 33 million in Canada, which makes up the bulk of it. Just a second here. And these birds will swing like a pendulum. They'll go in Western Canada 1 year, in Alaska, and then all of a sudden they'll swing straight across to eastern boreal forest, eastern North America, if the cone crop is better there. This year, they almost all swung to the west. We'll see in a map in a second. They're quite rare actually to find east of Lake Superior right now. In the winter of 2021, they were widespread. This was when the year we had the super flight. There's something I'll show you. There's a trend that you will see here. There's a line of white-winged crossbills sightings along the North Shore of Lake Superior and the West Shore of Lake Michigan. That indicates a good sign of where the birds came from. Here they came in from the northwest. This area up here in the far northwest corner in the slide here had a great cone crop, but however, in early November, they had 4 to 5 days of strong freezing rain, which cut off the food source for the crossbills. So being a very nomadic species, they just flew. And they flew southeast, hit Lake Superior, and swung around it and came into the Chicago area, Minneapolis, looking for food. Next one. In the fall of 2022, there are very few around. They're along the coast where there is a cone crop in lower St. Lawrence, right along the coast there. But inland, they're quite rare. Last year, we had food, the best crop of food in North America was in the east here. And as you can see, they were strongly and widespread in the east. But now they've swung all the way to the west. This is currently, as of this morning, this map here in eBird. All these red dots, if you're not familiar with eBird, are within sightings within the last 30 days. The blue dots are after 30 days. You can see there are white-winged crossbills, but they're very few and far between. A lot of these are just one bird sightings. And on the east coast here, along the Maine and Canadian Maritime provinces, there is a crop of red spruce that actually has a pretty good cone crop, and that's where these crossbills seem to be setting up for the winter. As you know, in Chicago ornithologists, you can see that this year you pretty much have no reports of white-winged crossbills. They're so few and far between. Last year, being on the western edge of the food source, you had them pretty widespread. Again, you can see that a lot of them came in from the west because they're lined up on Lake Michigan, but Michigan itself had some, so it indicates they were more widespread. But in 2020, they were all on the west side of Lake Michigan, very few in Michigan. It indicates that they came in from the west and northwest. Lake Michigan is for Finch forecast. Lake Michigan is a very nice point of reference because you can see which way a lot of these finch flights have come from. Our next species is red crossbill. There's several different types. They differentiate them by their call types. The ones in eastern and central North America are called type 12 now, the eastern or the Great Lakes red crossbill. My co-board member who started the Finch Research Network is a huge red crossbill person. If you get a recording of a red crossbill, you can send it to Matt Young and he'll tell you what type it is. The eastern populations, about 175,000, so they're much fewer in numbers than the actual white-winged crossbills, but they're much closer to the human population most of the year. This is white-winged crossbills. For last summer, they showed us where the belt of food was before we even put the forecast out. They were already in there. And then in the winter, they were scattered. And the species loves white pine and red pine, and it'll take a lot of the like Norway and ornamental spruces. It'll quite happily go to those. And here it was basically in the patches of white pine and in New England into the red spruce and white pine. And they're always in West Virginia area in the lower Adirondacks. There's a population that stays there all year round. The current distribution of red crossbills in eastern North America. There's a few north of Chicago, some birds scattered to the southwest, but they're in these patches of white pine through Wisconsin, Minnesota, where there's it's a great crop of white pine, but in very small patches. You could drive for 30 miles and see nothing, and drive for 5 miles and see nothing but cones. It's very patchy, but the birds are in where the cones are. Similar Ontario, but along the coast of eastern North America through Nova Scotia, Maine, all the way down to Massachusetts, there's a good red spruce crop. And that's where a huge number of the red crossbills have come into to feeding on the conifers crop that's right along the coast. Our next species is pine siskin. They're the Swiss Army knife of winter finches. They can eat seeds, they'll take the insects, they'll take very different types of seeds. And they like the white-winged crossbills, they like to move back and forth across eastern North America. In 2021, when we had our super flight and there was not much food in the east, they came down in big numbers. On eBird maps that have the purple, the darker the purple is the higher the percentage of checklists that had this species on it. On a big scheme, it's a good indicator of where the birds went to. In 2021, there were a lot of birds in the southern US, coast to coast. 21 last winter, they were through the Great Lakes, through some small numbers went to south. They were in the Rockies, the coastal areas, and in the lower boreal forest. This fall, they followed that crop and huge numbers went all through the Rockies, eating on that spruce crop with the crossbills. In the east, they look like they're widespread. They are widespread, but a lot of these checklists are single birds. Last year's winter, 2021, where they were widespread with the crop, you can again see this thick line of sightings all along the Lake Michigan shoreline. It indicates that a lot of white-winged pine siskins were coming in from the west and northwest to join this area of food. And they were hitting Lake Michigan and either going around to the south or going around to the north. Currently, they are again right now from Mexico all the way up in northern Canada towards Alaska on that big cone crop. Some of the ones in the east have finally left the boreal forest. They're eating what cedar crop was up there, and they're slowly showing up at feeders. But this big, huge, light pink area are scattered birds, and they're mostly single birds. In more detail here, they look to be so widespread. They are widespread, but most of these sightings here are single birds or very small flocks. The common and the hoary redpolls, these are the ones a lot of people love to see at feeders. They're very charismatic, and they love the weedy fields. They love to come to feeders and eat the Niger. They breed up in the northern boreal forest up above the tree line, and they come down. We thought this year in the east they would come down in good numbers, but they gave us a little surprise, which I'll talk about in a second. There's two, it's a debate if this is one species or two species, because they've done some genetic work. They all seem to be one species, but we still consider them multiple. The common redpoll has more striping, darker bird, larger bill. The hoary redpoll, much more whited and frosted, whitish rump, and a small pushed-in bill. Hoary redpolls breed up in the treeless tundra, and a lot of times they just come down to the northern edge of the boreal forest. Common redpolls are breed to the northern half of the boreal forest, to north of the boreal forest, and they're the ones that come down in more numbers than the hoaries. A charismatic survivalist. One second here. This species has been built to survive the cold weather. In the boreal forest, it can get down to minus 40, 45 Fahrenheit regularly at night. So what this species does to survive the night is it just plops into the snow, burrows a tunnel about a foot under the snow, and makes a little room down there, and it sleeps there overnight to avoid the really cold weather.
Wow.
The University of Alaska did studies on this species and the hoary redpoll, and what they basically did, which you can't do now because animal welfare things, which is actually quite good, they basically froze them to death. They wanted to see how long this little songbird could survive the cold. And the common redpoll could survive down to minus 78 Fahrenheit, and minus 72 Fahrenheit, and the hoary redpoll made it down to minus 88 Fahrenheit. So basically they froze them to death. But these things are so tough, they can survive really cold temperatures, which we cannot. Other survival ways they have a pouch in their esophagus, which when they come to your feeder, you see them come to the feeder and they're just gorging away, and then they disappear. They all have to fill the sac inside their esophagus so full of seeds, and then they go to a warmer, sheltered spot and just slowly digest the seeds. Once that pouch is empty, they come back in and refill it again. In 2021, we had a big eruption in eastern North America. You can see the dark purple. These birds made it down into New Mexico, down into Georgia. They really love the St. Lawrence Valley, where basically it's the first areas of farmland or weedy fields that come out of the solid forest. They key in on those areas quickly, and they love their weedy fields and Niger at seeds at the feeders. Last year, 2021, they were all over the place. They didn't come in from the east. I mean, from the west. There's some came in from the west, but lots came from the north, as Michigan actually had birds compared to just Wisconsin and Illinois. This arrow here is a bird observatory in Quebec called Tadoussac. They are this site here at Tadoussac, and way over here at Hawk Mountain in Hawk Ridge in Minnesota. They're two sources of early information for me on the flights, because they started monitoring them at the beginning of September. Tadoussac especially, because they do a morning flight of whatever flies by, and a lot of birds will come pouring through there, the finches, before the forecast even comes out. And that year in 2021, 22, last winter, they had over 2,000 common redpolls that came in, and all these redpolls were heading southwest into this food source. We figured they came in from the northwestern North America and came in, hit the Atlantic coast of Labrador, and turned around and flew south along the north side of the water, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, into this belt of food. Winter finches do not like to fly over open water. They really do not want to do that. They will fly primarily during the day. So a little songbird going across a body of water becomes easy prey for predators like gulls and merlins and all that. So they try to avoid open water. So as you see, they'll move around these shoreline areas quite happily, but they do not want to cross open water when they can avoid it. So with the forecast at the time we had all the information we had, it was a very poor birch crop that we could see around. So we figured in the east there'd be a much stronger flight than what we're seeing for redpolls. There's small numbers of redpolls scattered all across central and eastern North America, but they're generally small flocks. What happened in December, we started seeing bigger flocks heading west around Lake Superior area. And the thought is that a lot of these birds are coming out of the Arctic and coming out of northern Quebec, they went west into that huge spruce crop to feed on them. But also another theory is in eastern North America currently, there's, compared for the last 10 years, we don't have a lot of snowy owls this winter or a lot of rough-legged hawks, which both that points to there's probably a lot of lemmings and voles up in the Arctic and northern boreal forest. So if there's a lot of those rodents there, it means there's probably a lot of food source, which is a lot of seed like dwarf birch and that. So we're thinking possibly that a lot of redpolls are still sitting up there feeding on the seed crop in these dwarf birches above the tree line. And hopefully they'll come later in the winter. The current redpoll distribution for this winter, as of this morning, around the Chicago area, they're here. Again, a lot of these are just single birds and they're widely scattered, which unfortunately for a lot of us in the east that's what it's like this year for us. Hoary redpoll, the northern cousin or northern brother and sister of the common redpoll, depending how you look at the genetics. In 2020, 2021, the superflight year, from Detroit all the way down in lower St. Lawrence Valley, it was so thick, and New England was so thick with common hoary redpolls. We hadn't seen anything like this in years. This is the previous 5 years in the same area. Just a small portion of what came through during that superflight. This year, this is currently all the reports of hoary redpolls. Small numbers in the traditional areas in the lower St. Lawrence, but they're just scattered even up high. And there's a flock up here on Baffin Island, well above the tree line still, which I found out a friend of mine's daughter is actually feeding them. She has a feeder set up there. She set up there in late summer, and she has over 30 hoary redpolls that are coming to her feeder. Basically, the only birds that are in town other than ravens that far north. The purple finch, charismatic little guy, and this bird is like one of the early, like red-breasted nuthatches. They migrate, they will erupt early. Before I even start putting the forecast together, I can tell if it's going to be a good year for these two species, because red-breasted nuthatches start moving in July, and these will start moving in early August. The male is a nice dark raspberry color, gets confused a lot with house finches, slightly bigger, slightly darker. The female has a really nice dark brownish stripe through her eyes and more spotting. I actually, in this species, I prefer the female. I think she's prettier than the male. Their summer breeding range is in the lower boreal forest, right across the belt and upper states, Michigan, Wisconsin, all the way through New England. And the superflight of 2021, like so many of the other species, they went south. They went south of us. They went south of Canada. Most of them went south of Chicago into Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee. They got those finches. We didn't have them. Last year, they moved a little further south, but we had pretty widespread distribution for the species in more of their traditional way. Currently, if you look in the Chicago area, there are winter purple finches scattered throughout the whole Chicago area. A lot of these birds are probably tied to feeders right now, but this species and evening grosbeaks, they like to be in areas, it can be suburban areas, but they want around 50% or more tree cover if they're going to sit in. So some of these areas here are more attractive to them, but these species will come to your feeders and they'll be locked in your feeders all winter long. And they're one of the winter finches that tolerate urban areas better than other ones. Now the pine grosbeaks, I heard someone wanted one of the birds they wanted to see. Well, they're on the move. They were moving, but then something happened. This is the species that does not want to leave the boreal forest. They quite happily, on years where there's not a good berry crop or a good seed crop, they'll quite happily sustain themselves through the winter eating tree buds, eating birch, alder, spruce buds, getting those nice new buds growth, and that's how they can survive the winter. But they love mountain ash crop. This year in the eastern boreal forest, the mountain ash crop was quite poor. So we expected to be a good flight, and they started moving quite nicely in good numbers. This is the big flight year, the super flight year. They came down, just a few scattered birds in Illinois, but northern Michigan across. This year, currently, they're in the similar way, but they're slightly, for us in the eastern Great Lakes, they're slightly north of most urban areas. Why? This year, I don't know why, but most of the ash species, green, white, and black ash, are having a bumper crop of seeds this year. Emerald ash borer, the insect, is killing so many ash. And a lot of these ash that are having this big, heavy crop, bumper crop, are actually in a state of dying. It's almost like, I don't think there's any scientific evidence. It's almost like they decided to give it one last grasp to try to save themselves. But it's known that evening grosbeaks and pine grosbeaks will happily eat ash seeds. But this year, the pine grosbeaks didn't just like eating it. They almost became addicted to it. It stopped them dead in their tracks, and they're happily peeling all the ash seeds they can. This is a flock of 30 just north of Toronto that found this tree. Ken McDonald was telling me about a week ago, it was full of seeds, and 28 birds have been basically stripping it down to the last few seeds. Once they're done this, we expect them to move into urban areas and move further south, looking for the ornamental crab apples, which they love in the cities, and mountain ash berries. But the ash crop, which has been quiet for the last several years, just exploded, and that changed the whole forecast for this species, and for slow the evening grosbeaks down too. Now, 1 second. This species here is the rise of the evening grosbeak. This is the charismatic winter finch that so many people love. So many people will talk about how they used to see it in their childhood in the 60s and 70s, and it used to be all over the place, coming to people's feeders right in the middle of major cities. During the late 60s to early 80s, there was a huge explosion of their major food source, spruce budworm. So the population exploded and had great breeding. Spruce budworm collapsed. This species collapsed, and it's declined 92% in the population since that event. However, is the rise of evening grosbeak? They're so tied to spruce budworm, and spruce budworm is on a rise too. And I'll explain to them and after the evening grosbeaks, I think. This is the current distribution of the species. Last year, it was basically just to the north of Chicago and north of New England, and that just coming at a food source there, had feeders. This year, it's much closer to what happened in 2020 when there wasn't a food source here, and you had a big flight of evening grosbeaks that went south. Most of the evening grosbeaks in the boreal are in this area right now, in the eastern central boreal, because that's where the spruce budworms are. And they will move southwest. Birds in Quebec go southwest of the Great Lakes. Ones come funneled right through Ontario into Detroit, towards Chicago. And lots will this year funneled into northern Upper Peninsula, Wisconsin, and into Michigan, and down into northern Illinois too. This shows for several years we had the collapse, and their population was so low. On the left-hand side is all the winter records for 10 years of evening grosbeaks being seen. Small numbers were coming by, scattered birds here and there. And then last year, when they had the first big eruption, They came down in big numbers in the Tennessee, northern Georgia. First time in 30 years that an evening grosbeak showed up in Florida. It was actually just outside Orlando. So that's the first time they've done that in years. Currently, as today at noon, this is the most recent distribution of evening grosbeaks in the last 26 days. They're scattered along the north shore of Lake Ontario, east northern Michigan, and through Wisconsin. And they're scattered birds all to the south, but they're all favoring forested areas. It doesn't have to be all forest. It seems to be has to have at least 50% forest by the looks of it. A lot of these birds are sitting at now, they're hooked on feeders. In this area too, in addition to the black oil sunflowers, when they're hitting the feeders, they're going to the ash crop, which the pine grosbeaks seem to have a big affinity to this year. Currently, this is the city of Toronto, right downtown, CN Tower here, in the suburbs. The species is sitting, as you can see, in areas where it's small towns, near towns, well, to 100,000 people, but it's like 50% plus of forest cover. It doesn't have to be solid forest, but they like that mosaic of that much forest. And they've set up there for the winter with the odd bird showing up in their town. Wintering ones, the last 10 years around Chicago. Oh, second here. Again, scattered, but you can see they're more towards forested areas or where you get about 50% cover. So in the Chicago area, if you're going to look for them right now in the winter, try to find areas where it's similar to that. It can be suburban, rural, but have a good forest cover. And if you can find any ash trees, or people, especially people have bird feeders, the black oil sunflower seeds, they will quite happily go there, and they get hooked. Once they get hooked on a feeder, they'll probably be there for most of the winter. The feeder keeps going. 2020, we had something that had not happened in 50 years. We had, during the superflight, we had a superflight of evening grosbeaks. The diamonds are where 100 evening grosbeaks a day. The stars are where there've been over 400 evening grosbeaks a day recorded migration. That's my house right up over here is 100. 23 I had that day, over 400 in downtown Toronto. The Point Pelee area, they had 400 just east of Point Pelee, and just east of Point Pelee, they had 1,300 come by in one day. And this is a bluff on the east shore of Lake Huron, which I'll talk more about in the next slide, but it's been the birds hit, coming from Quebec and Northern Ontario, they hit the shoreline Lake Huron and they don't want to go across. So they swing by and then come in to the United States, just north of Detroit, and head southwest, which Chicago is one of the trajectories they're heading towards. So 2020 was huge flight days. Like I said, Hot Cliff, the North Shore Lake Erie, 905, downtown Toronto, 415, the Bluff on the east side Lake Huron, 575, North Shore Lake Erie again, 1,300. And then this year at the Bluff with east winds, they had 1,805 evening grosbeaks come by in a hawk watch, hitting the shoreline, not wanting to pass over the lake, following the shoreline southwards, heading towards Michigan. We hadn't seen them for so many years. So I've talked to older naturalists and looked in the literature. Hasn't been recorded since 1972. So basically 50 years since we've had these big flights recorded. 1969, 500 birds through downtown Toronto. 1972, 2,800 through all the shot, which is about 45 minutes west of Toronto, Lake Ontario shoreline, heading westward. 1972, same area, they had over 1,000. These birds were punching through and not stopping, heading on a direct flight, heading towards Michigan. And you see the dates here and the dates in the previous slide. It's 10 days on either side of Halloween seems to be the flight. If you want to know if you have a shot at evening grosbeaks in your area, those right around Halloween is looking at eBird reports around, in Wisconsin or over towards New York, Southern Ontario. They'll tell you if they're coming. We have the Finch Research Network has a web page on Facebook, and there's also a Finch eruption and cone crop page on Facebook too. They regularly get posted when people start seeing these sightings and these movements of these evening grosbeaks. In the spring, they'll be coming through, heading back north and heading back northeast the last week in April to the first 2 weeks of May. So if you're at your favorite warbler spots watching migration, it's a good chance you might see evening grosbeaks that went past Chicago coming back heading to the northeast. This is the superflight distribution of evening grosbeaks in 2020, where everyone's so excited that they punched so far south. This is what it currently is this year. Not as far south, but they did go south. They've come in good numbers. That line of bumper ash crops slowed them down, and then slowed them down enough that when people started putting up their bird feeders in bear country, after the bears hibernated, the evening grosbeaks figured out there's another food source. So a lot of them slowed down and decided to stay for the winter. Since the species is declining so much, there's several research projects on it. This David Yaney from the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, he's had them show up at his father's property in Western Pennsylvania for the last decade, every couple of years. So he wanted to know what was going on with them. Because he'd see one flock, he'd go to the feeder, and he'd see one flock, and it'd be 30% males, 70% females. And then 2 hours later, the flock's back, and it's 50-50. So he's wondering what was going on with this. So he put some Modus tags on the birds, with the Modus towers. If you're familiar, Modus towers is a system of receiving towers put across North America now, and these little tags you put on the birds when you band them. If a bird comes within a certain range of that tower, it will ping off the tower, and the information will be downloaded which bird came through. So David put a lot of those on there, but he's also putting satellite tags. There's a long tag here. Since the evening grosbeak is a larger, chunkier finch, it can take on these satellite tags, which smaller pathrons can't. So they did the tracking in these. I'll show you some of the results. They found that in the wintering areas, when they have feeders, it's not just one flock. Sometimes it could be 2-3 flocks working in the same area. You're thinking you're looking at the same flock of evening grosbeaks at your feeder, but you could actually have 2-3 different flocks as they move around the neighborhood, sometimes up to 30-40 miles away, as they hit these different target feeders that they know who's feeding what and where to go. So they found some of the preliminary research so far. They found this is where they're being banded here in northwestern Pennsylvania. This is the spring migration of one of the Modus tag birds. It flew north to Lake Erie. It could cross a short distance to Long Point on North Sawyer Lake Erie, which is a bird magnet area, but it did want to cross. Being a day flyer, diurnal flyer, it doesn't want to go across the water because it'll be easy target for the gulls and that. So it flew along the shoreline, crossed into Canada at Buffalo, hit Lake Ontario shoreline, said, nope, not going there. Swung around Lake Ontario, went north away from the city, and then it started turning, reorienting itself. And the next tower that it hit was in its breeding area in northeastern Quebec. So they found, like, when they come in migration, they don't want to cross lakes, so they're being funneled down into this area here, heading towards Chicago. This is one of the birds that they put satellite transmitters on. It was banded up here in northern Maine, where we now have a feeder camera there. And it transited around the feeders. Then it moved up in migration up to where it bred here in Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. And then it just meandered on the way back down, came back to where it was banded, roamed around, didn't care so much. And then it went on a flight into the Quebec-Maine border, which it is currently, and it's visiting feeders in little towns, trying to set up a little circuit. This is, we've heard, a lot of birders have heard literature, the budward warblers, bay-breasted, Tennessee, and Cape May, and how they depend so much on this spruce budworm, and when there's outbreaks, those populations explode. Currently, the Cape May warbler is having a big resurgence. The other two, not so much, but the Cape Mays are really benefiting from it. This caterpillar is the bane of all forest industry in the boreal forest, and it is the savior of so many insect-eating birds, including these finches. It primarily feeds on balsam fir, but also lesser degree white spruce and black spruce. It can cause severe defoliation, actually can kill forest there. So they try to spray it with a bacteria called, what was it? BTK. It's a spore, it's a bacteria spore which they spray on there and the caterpillar ingests. And they try to keep it down to 60% coverage of the forest, a layer of just of spruce budworm, instead of being the 100% of the area they survey covering spruce budworm. They try to get down 60% because they can't stop it. They just try to slow it down and save some valuable timber. For a lot of these small communities, that's not a resource base. This is the only job in town. So these three absolutely benefit from spruce budworm. The pine siskin on the left, it eats the egg sacs, it eats the small caterpillars, the regular sized caterpillars. Purple finch and even grosbeak, they in these outbreak areas, up to 80% of their diet during breeding season can be spruce budworm caterpillars. So in areas where there's a big outbreak, they can have great breeding, which they seem to be having in the last few years. This is an area in northeastern Ontario 2 years ago and last year that is slowly being defoliated by the spruce budworms. They will eat the tips of the new growth and eat the way back. And the forest, these trees can survive this for about 4 or 5 years before they die. Past spruce budworm outbreaks, Ontario's last large infestation, 1980, 49.5 million acres. Quebec had a much larger one, slightly earlier, but 79 million acres. In Eastern Canada, in 1975, 129 million acres was considered spruce budworm outbreak. And this is what caused primarily the evening grosbeaks to explode in population in the East. They benefited from this and they had huge numbers. That's why in those decades we were seeing them in our feeders rather commonly. In 2021, we had primarily 4 spruce budworm outbreaks: the North Shore of Quebec, Gaspé Peninsula, Quebec, southwestern Quebec, and northeastern Ontario. And each one of these pine trees are small areas of outbreaks starting to show up. For all through the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, it was very small in Quebec. And then you can see 2010, the spruce budworm just started exponentially growing in areas they were covering. 13.5 million hectares in 2020, 9.6 million before. They're over 20 million now. Let's say 22 million. This is what it currently looks 1 year later. It's almost a solid outbreak from the island of Newfoundland all the way over to almost Lake Superior across. It's solid spruce budworms and they're still expanding. So it's 54 million acres right now, estimated to be infested with the budworm outbreak. So it's about 30% of the total big 129 million that they had in 1975. We're about 30% of that size right now. This is benefiting the budworm warblers. It's benefiting the evening grosbeaks heavily. And so Ontario had the small little area here in Ontario. It's has exploded almost 3 times its size in a year. This is not a finch, but this is one thing that people like to look for in the finch forecast, the Bohemian waxwings. This is 2012 to 2022. And people who bird 10 years ago will know in the Chicago area, the winter of 2012, 2013, there were a lot of Bohemian waxwings scattered all over this area. That was the last big year. This is currently what the Bohemians are looking like. They're getting more near the traditional boundary, but there are individuals that are moving further south. In the Chicago area, here till early May, like personally, east of Toronto, my lifer Bohemian waxwing was the middle of May, which I didn't expect a quote unquote winter bird that time. But individuals will get lost, separate from their flocks, and then who do they look for? Someone who looks similar. Look at cedar waxwing flocks in the Chicago area closely this winter, because there's a good chance there's probably in a flock of 30, 40 cedar waxwings, you might get 1 or 2 Bohemians sneaking in there, just trying to find a close friend of theirs. Well, the future forecast goals. We would love to expand the cone crop reporter roster with more people And more areas, you do not have to be an expert on trees. You do not have to be an expert on bugs. Just generally what you see in your area. We provide a little template of what to look for and how you personally view it, because this is a citizen science project. And everyone I found, only once in the last 3 years did I have, from a similar area, did have people, one person giving a conflicting view. Everyone seemed to ballpark this whole cone crop quite nicely. It actually works out quite nicely. When we get a couple of people in the same area, the data gets really, really reliable, we find. We want to increase the diversity of reporter backgrounds. First Nation, more forestry professionals, research, naturalists, bird atlasers, naturalists, casual bird watchers, or people just going out for a hike or a paddle someplace. Just generally what they see in terms of the different cones and seed pods, because not only is it good in the boreal forest to know this, it's good to know south of the boreal forest, knowing where a good chance where these birds are going to go and stay for the winter. And we're currently developing an app and testing it right now in the iNaturalist program for helping people look at cones to age them and show them what a large cone crop is and a weak cone crop is. First, I would like to thank all these people. This is why the Finch Forecast exists. These are all the great individuals who go out there and put their time and actually look at trees. Not just me driving all over Eastern Boreal Forest, stopping and staring at trees and having my daughters humor me while I do that. A lot of these people put in good effort, what they see during the summer, just generally and give me a report back in August, September of what their personal thoughts are. These are the people who make this. Without this, the forecast couldn't happen. In 2020, Matt Young developed the Finch Research Network. This is the home of the Winter Finch Forecast now for the last 3 years. The Finch Research Network is a nonprofit, and we try to raise funds to help do finch research. David Uni's program on the satellite and modus tagging of the evening grosbeaks have benefited from some of this funding. And some will be going apparently to the rosy finches program and research down in Western North America. We try to update this as weekly or monthly as we can right now. Give you updates where the finches are, give you some tips. There's a really good tip, one in there written by Ryan Mendelbaum about Easter tree guide in Crossbills. It's telling you what trees are in Eastern North America that the white-winged and red crossbills prefer, and generally what time of year the cones ripen for these birds. It's quite a good article, and I recommend visiting this site regularly. Another thing, feeder cameras. The one thing that, for me personally, was good for COVID. Being stuck at home and not being able to go roam around for work, and that I started finding these feeder cameras. And you were able to watch all the winter finches. If not in your backyard, you can watch them quite nicely. The one on the left is the one through Cornell and Northern Ontario Manitou Wash. It currently has common redpolls, pine grosbeaks, and the odd evening grosbeak. The one on the right is from the Finch Research Network in Northern Maine. It has right now currently, I think I had 72 evening grosbeaks when I looked at it today. It's quite heavily with evening grosbeaks, pine siskins, but the great thing about feeder cameras, you can track, for me being a biologist, I can track the eruption of these birds. Last year in Europe, there's a finch called the brambling. It's a pink and black, beautiful little finch. It breeds in Siberia through Scandinavia. Just casually watching feeder cameras, I watched feeder cameras in Scandinavia explode with these finches all over. And then after about a week, the finches were gone. And then I watched on cameras in Britain, France, Hungary. All of a sudden, their feeder cameras were just all swamped with these birds, because the bramblings came down there, and that's where they went. You could actually track them, and then in the spring, you could track them going back through Scandinavia towards Siberia. So, great way to watch birds too. The feeder cameras from all over the world, including Africa, with great watering holes. So if you can't get out, cold winter day, you want some entertainment, Mother Nature's on TV now. This bird here is the Pallas's rose finch from Japan. I took this picture in 2020. I joked around the first year when I did this talk that who knows, you might see a rare bird, just joking around with this rare bird. Well, little did I know that this bird showed up 2 weeks after I was joking around with that. This is a hawfinch, which is a European large finch. It's similar to our evening grosbeak. This is the first record in Canada. It's from the Yukon, almost on the Alaska border, and it stayed there all winter. You never know who will show up. Last year, the bramblings of the big eruption in Europe and in Asia showed up. Several of them showed up in Eastern North America on the Quebec, New England border. Currently, there's a few bramblings in Washington. You never know when some of these outlying birds come for a fly. If they're in search of food, they're going to go until they find a feeder. And I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for having me. And I hope you enjoy the talk, and I will try to answer as best I can.
Thank you so much, Tyler. That was great. I just want to remind everyone, please type your questions into the chat if you have any. And then also, as a reminder, Tyler's forecast, it's like a weather person's forecast. You cannot hold him accountable to anything that he says because it is unpredictable.
It's unpredictable. And one thing I forgot to mention, once this forecast comes out in late September, we have 4 animals. If you want finches to come south, you have to cheer for black bears, red squirrels, American robins, and Swainson thrushes, because all of those 4 animals will hit this crop of berries and seeds really hard in mid to late fall after the forecast is. And if there's a great cone crop, they can lessen it. If there's a poor cone crop in the boreal forest or berry crop, they can eliminate it before some of these winter finches come to the southern end of the boreal forest, and they'll have to keep going because the robin in your front yard this winter was spending the fall in northern Ontario or northern Michigan eating all the mountain ash berries.
All right. Well, I didn't know some of the ranges of these birds. It's quite incredible how far they'll go. My in-laws live in central Illinois, and they told me they saw a red crossbill a few years ago, and I assumed they were lying, but now I know that they could have been correct.
In a lot of these areas in towns with the older cemeteries that they planted all the ornamental spruce there, crossbills love to go to these ornamental spruces in the cemeteries. If they can't find much food, that's one of the key spots to find them.
Well, we do bird walks in cemeteries occasionally. So, all right, let's take some questions from the audience. We have a question from Joe. Considering there is an Appalachian subspecies of red crossbill, why isn't there a subspecies in the southern pine belt of longleaf, shortleaf, and loblolly pines?
The ones in the Appalachians, they basically are pretty much a hemlock red crossbill. They're pretty contained to the hemlock and the white pine and the mountaintops. I think some of it might have to be of humidity, why they didn't evolve to go down to those other nice pine forests. But a lot of you have some of the types of red crossbills that eat on ponderosa pine and similar pines in the western North America. I'm sure if they stray to the east, they quite happily like the crops that are in the southeast. But it's the ones in the northeast, they'll hit the red pine, but they seem to not want to come too far south. They're pretty confined, and the Appalachians are confined to pretty much the food source of the hemlock and the white pine, because their bills are slightly different on each type. They evolve with their cones, a lot of them. So maybe well back during glaciation, well before us, there was a population there, but they pretty much confined right now to the Appalachians, the upper Appalachians.
And Tyler, we have a few folks that are interested in how they can become monitors for cones in the Chicago area.
I can provide you my email and put me in contact with them. And then in midsummer, I send out the general form and ask you what to look for. And then I will email you again in mid-August going, okay, I need this information before mid-September, please, and see how they do. Because it could provide a great source, because that area there I know that birds that go there, but there's very little information that comes out of there. Okay,
great. If you are registered for the program, perhaps we can send out Tyler's email address to everyone when we put out the recording. Or you can, Tyler, if you want to put it in the chat, you can do that as well. Next question. We have a question about the bacteria that's used to kill the spruce budworms. Does that negatively affect the birds in any way?
It is the bacteria apparently doesn't seem to have much of an effect on it. The unfortunate thing is it's not very selective for Lepidoptera, the moth and the butterfly larvae, because they just spray the forest, and these caterpillars have to eat the needles that on the forest as they actually ingest the bacteria that's on the needles. So unfortunately, other Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moth larvae, will suffer too. But the actual birds themselves, it doesn't seem to have an effect.
Interesting. All right. Well, last call for questions. We had one comment from Jill. Now I understand better how my mother got a photo of 14 evening grosbeaks on her patio in eastern Georgia in 1972. Good history lesson here. All right. Last call for questions. Going once, going twice. Ooh, one more question. Have foresters considered working with the birds to control the budworms?
It's some of the talk, but a lot of the foresters are in the government is more. They're not so green. How can I put it? It's not so green that they are not so symbiotic with nature. They just want to figure out what they can do and what they can buy and spray and quantify it to the taxpayers. But trying to say working with the birds, you'll get some people who won't say it doesn't work. And the birds, the birds can't really control them. The birds are benefiting from them, but spruce budworm is very expansionist. As you saw between the 2 years, between 2021 and 2022, how much the infestation has expanded right across eastern North America. What basically controls them with Mother Nature, it's when they eat themselves out of house and home and there's nothing left and they start crashing. The spraying just barely, what they try to do with the spraying is just try and contain them near towns where there's a timber or paper mill, where there is jobs that relate to that forest, because they can't, this bacteria in the spraying is actually quite expensive. So if they leave Mother Nature alone to do this more, we'll get more birds. But unfortunately, they want to show the taxpayers, yes, we're doing something.
I'd rather hire the birds to do the work. It seems a little bit heavy-handed the other way, but okay. We also have someone that's a forestry student in Southern Illinois and would love to help with cone crop monitoring as well. So got a lot of interest in all parts of Illinois.
I would love that. Apparently there's a flock of evening grosbeaks down there for the last 2020, and apparently this year I've heard there's a flock down there in Southern Illinois somewhere. It's about 20-30 birds. I don't know where exactly down there. I've been told a few times, like, coming to feeders are pretty reliable down there when they move.
All right. Okay. Well, I think that's it for questions. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. This is just our first of the Birds and Bytes series that we're having for the year. Look for more episodes on different topics at chicagobirder.org/events. And then I also just want to remind you that we try to have as many free programs as possible. Pretty much all of our programs are free, and we can only do that through your donations and through your membership. So if you're looking to become a member of the Chicago Ornithological Society or to donate, you can go to chicagobirder.org/membership. Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you so much to Tyler for speaking tonight. Have a good evening.